Welcome to the new season, and welcome to today's podcast, which is a talk with Terry Geyer. He is the man that mapped perhaps the most important development of Silicon Valley 2.0, which is the field of biotech. What follows is a portion of a conversation with Terry Geyer. It's funny, I had started listening to an interview with Freeman Dyson, yet another one of those genius guys that worked on the Manhattan Project that was just a young teenager, another brilliant scientist. And post-war, after everything was over and computers were beginning to take off, and he was talking with Francis Crick as to what they should do with their lives now. And Cold War's on, and all this kind of changes happening and accelerating. And at one point, Freeman said, I think the future is going to be in biology. I think this computer thing will help it along, but I think at some point biology is going to be where things really take off and accelerate even faster. And I was I was always kind of struck by that some of those smart people really have a long view that it's far beyond anything I can grasp. But you worked on a series of maps that looked at after Silicon Valley had grown up and it had become its own kind of strange industry. What was that like? What was it like for you?
Okay. Well, it was very interesting. I was born and raised in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and moved out here in 1976. So it was still the early stages of Silicon Valley, where like Polaroid and IBM was here, and the desktop computer was not anything yet. Later on, there was the Apple Macintosh, not the Apple Macintosh, the Apple II, and I did meet Steve Wozniak, and so it was and I was doing graphic design work at the time, and I did things like brochures for people that were making PC board tracings, and it was sort of very industrial and early stages, sort of a transition from other kinds of industries into this new computerized industry.
So even then, as things were kind of changing, and it goes from literally 1 week it's a bunch of orchards and groves to, they're pulling it all out, and turning it into Activision or something. But you felt the gravity of that whole change too. I mean, it affects you in the direction of what your career is going into.
I just kind of stumbled into it. I was doing graphic design first in San Francisco, and then down in Silicon Valley. And as I was in Silicon Valley, I started seeing all these strange kinds of requests for materials for that kind of industry. Then there were still a lot of orchards around, and farmers markets where you could get locally grown stuff everywhere. But quickly those orchards were disappearing, and they were being leveled and making just one-story buildings for these companies at the time. And big sprawling one-story buildings, and in the South Bay where property was fairly cheap. Then they started developing. Hewlett-Packard was a real early on company, and they were located in a beautiful orchard, which still existed into the 90s. But it was one of the last ones. Places had been leveled, going towards further south, and it was just becoming kind of a very boring sort of suburb of industrialization.
But you were working, but all of a sudden you start getting pulled into jobs here and jobs there, and next thing you know, you're doing some pretty specialized stuff in terms of artwork for all these technical companies.
I in the 90s, early 90s, was working on transitioning from graphic design to illustration, and I had run an ad in a more localized illustration presentation, and it was that was always available in New York, those kinds of illustration directories, but there was somebody that was developing one out here. And so it got around a lot. Everybody was looking at it. So from that, someone called me from, let's see, what were they called at the time? I can't even remember, but they were a woman and her husband that were doing these promotional advertising things about companies. Mm-hmm. And her father was a venture capitalist in the Silicon Valley, and so she kind of knew about these companies. And first, she started with with the computer industry, Silicon Valley, and then she got into that biotechnology was going to be the really big thing.
Yeah.
And so at that time, she started doing illustrated maps for those companies where she would sell space on it. Mm-hmm. You'd get your logo and your building on it, sort of a distorted map of the area. And she ran it like a contest, for an artist to do. And they approached me that way, they basically wanted me to, do a map and they would choose between my map and everybody else's and see if they'd win. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll do a small mock-up of an area but they liked it very much. It was good. And so I did, the first map I did for them was 1993 for Biotech Beach, they called it, which was the San Diego area.
Yeah.
They were just starting up a biotech industry in San Diego. Her first that she'd done had been for Biotech Bay, which is in San Francisco area. Yeah. So I did their first Biotech Beach map, and then basically I just kind of ended up taking over all of it. They had me do all the other ones as well.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I think all that concentration towards like Scripps and La Jolla and that whole area, that there's always been this kind of bio focus, which interestingly almost kind of goes full circle. I think goes back to Leo Szilard, another one of those guys that worked on the Manhattan Project, that at the end of his career, he ended up setting up his institution down there, and that was his whole focus, was all things bio. So that makes sense. But by the time that you do the Biotech Bay maps, I think we had one from 1995, and it's still showing the entire state. Literally going from
like... It shows the entire state, but what it is, it's a distorted state map, mm-hmm. which is basically just all of the biotech, all of the San Francisco area, and then it kind of dwarfs down to the Southern California.
Yeah.
And that's all the way all of them have been, because I do a Biotech Beach in reverse of that, where it just shows all of the San Diego area, and then the northern part of the idea is so that the state of California is still identifiable, but the focus is on that particular area.
We even had from the 1995, we had a T-shirt with your Biotech Bay map on it, and it kind of hit me then that.
No.
Yeah.
I was wondering where you found me.
Yeah. But it hit me that if you really wanted to identify a movement, and that there was this kind of distilled sense of identity in an industry, this is the way to do it. And it also kind of becomes this overlay of how you think differently about an area from there on too. That it's a pretty big impacting thing in many ways. So were you
they used to do lots of T-shirts.
Oh, did they?
Oh yeah, T-shirts for every area.
Yeah.
And it was very popular with all the employees for these biotech companies. We'd run into people with those shirts on all over the place. They were highly popular.
Yeah. So what other areas did you do? I know there was Biotech Beach, Bay. Was there some stuff, I think, for back in the Midwest that you might have covered?
Yes, it was Bio Midwest. There was Genetown, which is Boston area.
Okay.
It was Farm Country, which is basically East Coast, New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Connecticut. And then BioCapital, which was,
Virginia, D.C.
Yeah, showing all. Most of that were government involvement companies. And we did later on. We did Texas and Canada, and those didn't really take off. They're really smaller markets.
Same degree.
But,
I guess that's the other lesson. The thing about the digital age is, supposedly from the beginning, it wasn't going to matter where you live, and you could just be connected virtually, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, in a lot of industries, it does matter. And that concentration really breeds this whole kind of cross-pollination, workers having the fluidity of moving from company to company, drags ideas and energy in different places. And a lot of times it really it demands a certain level of smart. It's no coincidence that Bay Area thing of being by Stanford and Berkeley and all these other companies or colleges, that it really does. It builds a concentration that once it gets momentum, it starts taking on a whole different character.
Oh yeah, and it's famous around here that you work for one company for a while, and then you get laid off. When we would have 5 years of boom and 5 years of bust. So when the bust came, people lost their jobs and they ended up moving into other companies. And then when the boom came, that they were someplace else. So there was a lot of cross-pollination. And there's so many brilliant people around here with Stanford and Cal, Berkeley, that they were developing this talent. And a lot of the top people taught in those universities, especially as they, moved out of their own businesses and into, something a little different for them in education. And so yes, there was so much cross-pollination, and there would be, top people in these different companies that started out just really tiny little things and garages and small office buildings. Gradually they would build up and these people became like magnets for the brilliant students coming out of these schools.
Yeah. I guess that's the essential thing is it's more of an ecosystem than I suppose sometimes we realize. But somebody had pointed out that while Silicon Valley's almost become this world power, this kind of unchecked force, we realize that now. But the hint is that the biotech industry could be that next level. When computing,
the biotech industry is just as solid, if not even stronger, than the computer industry now.
Yeah,
it is quite amazing around here. The brilliant people that you run into all the time, and the money that's around here.
Yes,
it's really crazy.
Yeah, it's of colossal proportions that you think of empires. It's very deep. And I have to say, you're I really envy in a lot of ways, not just your skill, but you've had the chance to meet and talk with and kind of get the sense on a lot of these important people. For heaven's sakes, it goes from Gordon Moore to Wozniak to everybody in between. And this has been part of an ongoing project that you've had of doing paintings for Silicon Valley Luminaries. Can you tell us a bit about the whole experience of doing portraiture for the kind of giants whose shoulders we're standing on right now? What was that like?
Well, it was very interesting. I met the supplier who stretched canvases for me, had come down to deliver some canvases to me and for a portrait. He said, he had a client down here that had lost his portrait artist, and he asked him to come down and bring suggestions, because this guy that did the stretchers and canvas for famous artists basically, and all over the area and all over the country at the time. And I said, well, here's my brochure of like portraits. He said, yeah, can I have it? I said, sure, give it to him. So I was working in Menlo Park at the time. I had my studio in Menlo Park, and that same afternoon, the gentleman called me, and he liked the idea that he was in Atherton, which is just 10 minutes away from me, and so he wanted me to come and meet him. He was also a property developer. He was a retired patent attorney and a property developer, and the first portrait that he had made had something like 15 inventors on it, of the really early inventors, and with their inventions, and had Stanford University in the background of it, and it was 18 feet wide by 9 feet tall.
Holy God. It's a truck.
Yeah, so they're pretty much life size. That's what he wanted me to see. I went to see it, and I said, yeah, it's gorgeous, and then he told me what he wanted to do. What he was thinking about doing was different industries, and he said he was in his 80s at the time, and he said he was concerned that these inventors were still around that first did these things, but they were dying off, and and he thought that they needed to be remembered before they passed, and he wanted to interview them as well. So he decided like 5 inventors per painting, and he wanted them to be 9 feet by 6 feet. And we talked about it, and he started dragging me around to the different companies and meeting people. And that same day,
wow,
took me up to Ampex in a couple places.
Wow,
I think new people
firsthand.
Wow. And so I pitched him and said, how much would it be? And I said, and I told him per inventor, and he said, well, that's the same thing he was paying the other guy. And so that was fine. It was quite lucrative. So we decided we had to start finding these people, and Gordon Moore was the first one we approached.
Wow.
We managed at the Computer History Museum, we managed to talk one gentleman into giving me his email address. So he responded, and then it got to be a little easier as we went on, because we could say, well, we've seen Gordon Moore, and we've seen Ted Haas, and then they go, oh, okay, well, you guys are all right.
You're legit,
It does come. Yeah, and Wozniak, Harold, which was my client, had me start trying to find some of these people. And Wozniak, I was able to find a phone number for him that was listed for his website, the ownership of the website. So my client called him, and it was his cell phone, and it was in Zurich or something like that when he got the phone call.
Wow.
And so we set up a lunch meeting. We talked to him about it and what we were doing, and that we needed him, something to do with what he was doing, and he suggested that, wiring a PC board for an Apple One. Yeah. And so we said, well, we had hoped he would have brought the PC board for the Apple One with him, because he has one. He said, well, can we come and see you at home? And so I said, sure, I'm accessible. And so we went to his home, and he had all the stuff there, and he had like the original tools that he did made the first, so
like literally in the room where it all happened.
Yeah, he had this old plywood desk and credenza that his dad built or he built, and it no finish on it, and that's what he worked on.
Soldering away.
Yeah, soldering away. He did a beautiful soldering jobs on PC boards, and he had 2 dogs that were down by his feet, while he was working, and
wow.
And he's a real practical joker, so he had the soldering iron in place. I said, well, you don't have to, hold it. He said, oh, it's getting hot. I said, well, you're not that holding it. And he lifts up the soldering gun, and it's not plugged in.
Oh, that's awesome. Still had a sense of humor after all these years.
Yeah.
That's great. That's one thing that hit me immediately in getting a chance to talk with you, I went back and was looking at, all the important portraits that were done for Isaac Newton at the time, or Darwin at the time, or even Einstein.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
there is this incredible kind of lifeless de facto portrait of these people, whereas the work that you've done, the one thing that seems to be this undercurrent is you're catching people. It's a person. They're alive. There's a lot going on. There's this sense, some inner activity. It's not just this is what they looked like. You were always able to get, in meeting them, is there something that you just start to pick up, or how does that work? If you could.
Well, I'd meet them, so I got to know them a little bit. It was only pretty much one meeting. Sometimes I saw people 2 or 3 times. It's sort of how I wanted the people to be really my client wanted to show them with their inventions, but I always, rather than having them just, kind of doing what they were doing, I always wanted them to be looking at the viewer.
Yeah.
And I'd get a feeling for how they moved and everything. And I mean, I had to piece all these things together by, when an inventor first comes up with an invention, he's not famous. Mm-hmm. So there's no photographs of him or anything, I mean, I'm lucky if I can get a black and white press photograph of their face. So, and Tom Fogarty, who invented the ablation catheter, mm-hmm. He didn't even have any pictures of himself as a young man or anything. I had to I think we had a high school photograph in his yearbook or something.
Oh my gosh.
But I had to take his look and kind of then backdate him. Wow. I photographed him in the studio and I sort of backdated him. And then we were working at the Peninsula Hospital for a background for catheters, a room where they were doing angioplasties. Tom Fogarty used to work there, and everybody just loved him. He was just a wonderful guy, and so they saw what I was doing of him, pictures of him, of the painting, and they said, "Yeah, it looks just like him."
Oh, yeah, that's awesome.
It's like
that's awesome. Yeah, and I suppose that's the other thing is you get out of looking at all the different individual paintings is you get the sense of diversity of personality. Older portraiture, it tends to be, standardized or something along those lines, or even just made to work in its own composition. But there's something about each person in your portrait is alive. And it doesn't seem that they're just there. They're there for compositional reasons. They hold their own space and they hold their own individuality and everything, which is really impressive. And yeah, it's funny you should mention the whole thing with Woz, because you could sense that kind of twinkle in his eye, even in looking at the portrait that you did.
He's quite a character.
Yeah. Anybody else any other people that really kind of impacted you in the midst of all the work? I'm sure there's gobs of folks that you interacted with in doing the portraits.
Well, pretty much all of them were very welcoming, free with their time with us, helped to give us whatever we wanted. Doug Engelbart invented the mouse. Mm-hmm. He had developed Alzheimer's pretty badly, and so it was just a sweetheart, though. And he lightened up every time I met him several times, and he'd asked what my name was again, and I tell him my name is, and Terry Geyer. He had a childhood friend who was named Geyer, and so he'd always light up when I told him what my name was again.
Oh, that's awesome! That's awesome. I have to ask too. While you go all the way back to the beginning of that whole era, you also touch on. You also did portraits for Zuckerberg and Mark Andreessen from, and now we're onto the Empire era.
Yeah, and my client was wanted computer networking as the last 2 paintings I did for him before he passed away were computer networking and the internet. He wanted to just do computer networking, and there was a friend of mine who worked at the Computer History Museum, And we went over, and he kept going. You can't just, these are the networking guys that early on that made Cisco and all this the early wiring things and Roberts and the ARPANET, and said you just can't group them with the internet guys, and we can only have 5 people on a painting. So I talked to my client, and he says, fine, just do an internet painting too. And the networking people I was able to get a hold of, but the internet people, I couldn't get to them directly.
Interesting.
I sent packages to each of them, their direct assistants and stuff, and the guy for eBay, one of his assistants said that he would get a hold of me, but he never did. But what I sent a couple packages, and the second one I sent him, I said, listen, if I don't hear back from you, and if we can't get together, I understand you're busy and you're working on, this and that, but if not, then I'm going to use available resources and make the painting instead with that. So none of them really got back to me. I said, your approval will be assumed unless I hear from anybody else, hear that you don't want to be in the painting. So the internet one was really fun. I could just do anything I wanted because nobody ever got back to me. And that got to be, and it sort of centered on the Yahoo sign in San Francisco. Yes. So I got a lot of great visual stuff there. And I got Zuckerberg barefoot with a Macintosh. In his first office was just above a grocery store or something. And they would just sit around on the floor, barefoot and drinking beer. And
It's interesting to me that you went from shaking hands and being friendly with Doug Engelbart or Gordon Moore to you can't get a call returned for that final generation. That says something to me about the culture.
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, they were authentic, real people early on. And then the internet group was just, it was so many billions of dollars that they're dealing with constantly, and so much. And it was so of the time. Most of those other people, this is something that passed through a while back. So, talking about old times and stuff, and it's okay for them. But, so it was only that group. At first, my client was cautioning me. I said, listen, I made a disclaimer, I gave it to them. They know, they're aware of it. The people, their assistants, do talk to them, but, they don't want to talk to me. Fine.
Wow. That's crazy. That's crazy. Well, it's neat because you end up becoming, as just the young kid from Minnesota that could draw and could paint really well, you really end up becoming like the person to document, and you had a lot of firsthand experience. You kind of cut your teeth in that same region as all these industries kind of grow and change. So you're, in a lot of ways, you're the ideal guy to do it. Now, aside from having ridiculous technical skills, you're the person that would really get it in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I've been here since, most of the people, some of these things, the ARPANET and stuff predates me, but the other stuff was developed while I was here. And I remember trying to get and when I did all the maps for Biospace, you didn't have computers that could do that stuff where you could scan everything and move pieces of things together and make posters from it. So, I used to draw and paint the stuff and then take them to my pre-pass guy and we scan it and then we print it from there,
Wow.
It's like, so I was, in the early stages, I was trying to do medical illustrations on a Mac Plus.
Oh my gosh.
And I would keep crashing before I could finish. I was doing drawings in PageMaker and, it would, I'd almost get it and it would crash and I'd lose the whole thing.
God.
Because it was too much for the memory. It wasn't.
The nightmare of like trying to get it to render and that's hard stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff, I mean, I personally needed it too.
Yeah.
So I was really well aware of all the stuff that, I was going through the whole thing, because I ended up being a designer with computers and, from the early stage.
You grew with it too. So I before I forget, but the Biotech Bay project is still ongoing. You're still doing new maps.
I'm still doing new maps. So we've had, the company has been sold probably about 5 times and moved all over the country. But I'm still doing the maps, and it's been cut back. We don't do as much anymore, but I work on 5 of them a year now, and they don't do very many drawings of people's buildings anymore because they've got to charge them a lot more money. So we pretty much just put the logos on, and so I have to make the map much more interesting with other elements rather than the company's buildings.
Okay. Gosh, I cannot thank you enough for your time, Terry. It's really kind of you for letting me just run up on you
my pleasure.
And be able to chat. Our genuine thanks for a chance to talk with Terry Geyer. It was a fascinating time. Please feel free to visit him on his webpage at terryguyer.com, TerryGuyer.com. And of course, feel free to email us at newprojectionscast@gmail.com. All the best, and we'll catch you next time.